Hello and welcome and happy late Friday. It's This Is Going Well, I Think, with David Cooper, and I'm David Cooper. It's This Is Going Well, I Think, the show where no one's listening and no one cares, the show where every episode's the last episode. So this week, we tried to get a doctor who did penis enlargement injections on the show. Two doctors got back to us. I interviewed one about penis injections earlier in the week, and as my fellow broadcaster, Canadian Jim Richards, said to me, did you just have both them on your show because they both got back to you and it was just easier to go with what you booked than do something new, to come up with new creative ideas? Guilty as charged, I was. But I thought, fuck it, let's have him on the show, might be funny. So I had this guy on, and he was a urologist, not a plastic surgeon like the first one. And in the beginning of the interview, while talking about urology stuff, before we even get to penis injections, an offhand remark about the Canadian healthcare system makes this interview go off the rails. I ended up sitting across from someone who is my political opposite, someone I think is really far gone with the conspiracy theories, although I'm sure he thinks I'm far gone. I don't know, these kind of bizarre interactions where you can't predict where the show's going to go and you just roll with it is why I love this medium so much. Now, I should say this, I probably shouldn't have let this guy get away with so many points without responding to them, but I think I represented myself okay. And honestly, I was just so fascinated to talk to someone who was such a right-winger and kept saying things out of the conspiracy theorist playbook, but I was happy to be having the conversation. So with that, I present to you an interview with Dr. David Shusterman from New York, a urologist who does penis enlargement injections. Grab the popcorn. I wanted to talk a little bit about the penis injections, penis enlargement, but I also want to talk about urology and you. Is that sound like a good agenda?
I love it. I think it's a great idea. I think it's good to kind of get the background and not just talk about, just the topic of the day.
I completely agree. And I find urology fascinating. And did we have you on this podcast to get free medical advice? Maybe. That could be why you're here.
Well, I think it's an important thing to just, urology in general for men is a very important thing. And also for women, this is an interesting thing. Everyone thinks it's urology just for men. And in reality, women have bladders too.
Is this kind of like heart attacks? They affect women and men almost equally, but for some reason, men are more likely to seek treatment, be diagnosed, go to specialists when it comes to the heart and also urology?
Well, honestly, I feel like most men don't seek help. It just so happens that at some point it gets so bad that they actually need treatment because you really can't pee. At a certain point when you can't pee, you have big problems then.
So I went to the doctor and told her about a problem I've been having, but I also heard David Sedaris, the comedian, talking about this, how when you're a little kid, your pressure is like a fire hose. I mean, if you aim, you can go above your head. When you're in the urinal, it's splattering everywhere. And then as you become an adult, it trends towards the leaky faucet. Is this normal to sort of have pressure loss as you age?
Well, yes. So what happens is your prostate is like it's similar to what is like a drainage pipe, right? So what happens is that the bladder has to drain through this prostate, but the prostate starts accumulating, let's say, hair in it, the drain, like a drain. And then what happens is urine can't go through the prostate anymore because it's simply blocked by the enlarged prostate. So as you get over the age of, like, say, 40 to 50, your prostate starts growing really large and the inside channel just gets blocked up. And so similar to a faucet, you got to go in and roto-rooter it, or somehow remove all that like hair and gunk from inside the drain. It's very similar to what I do, but now we're doing it to the next level where we're actually not even operating anymore. Everything is done almost without surgery, where we simply go in through your veins and arteries. So, as your prostate grows, it needs more blood flow. Now we put medicine into those same arteries and then make them shrink down back to normal size. And that kind of cures the problem. So we're at the next stage of like urology evolution where we're doing nothing. We used to go everything through the penis and then try to remove everything. And that used to be called minimally invasive. Now, the next level of minimally invasive is actually not even going through the channel and going direct to the blood sources. So if you treat the blood sources, which is a non-surgical treatment, there's no really recovery time and there's very little to no complications. There's no effects on erections. So it's an amazing treatment now that we have, and I'm pioneering it basically in the urology field.
So my girlfriend calls me Dr. Dribbles, I guess, like Dr. Dre. So like after I pee, I sort of leak for half an hour. Is this something easy to fix? And side note, I'm also on Propecia, that male pattern baldness medication, but I thought it also is supposed to shrink the prostate as well.
Well, Propecia actually doesn't do very much for the prostate. I mean, it does shrink it, but the whole key of the prostate is that it's not the size that matters, it's the size of the hole that matters. So if your prostate's huge, it tends to have a smaller hole. But if you take Propecia, it doesn't actually open up the hole very much, which means that Propecia for prostate enlargement, or, it's not called Propecia for prostate enlargement, but the same medicine that's in Propecia, which is called Proscar for, which is a higher dose of Propecia. But essentially, the problem with Propecia and Proscar is that it has an effect on erections. And so I recommend people not be on it because of that. I think erections are more important than, there's better ways to fix hair loss.
As far as I know, I've been on it for about 10 years. I don't have that side effect, or I minimally have it. But in my early 20s, I was thinking, what's the point of having a strong erection if I have no hair to attract partners to use it?
Well, here's the thing. We have great hair replacement, not replacement, but we have great hair transplants now where we take little follicles called follicle unit transfers, and we remove just small little follicles from the back of your head and put it where you need it in the front of your head. And it gives you a great effect. Like, you could check out Matthew McConaughey. Matthew McConaughey had very bad male pattern baldness when he was younger, and now he has a very nice head of hair. And how did he do it? It was all through FUE, which is follicle unit transfers. So it's kind of like a very important treatment.
Okay, so maybe I'll go off this Propecia. I find when I forget to fill my prescription and I'm off it for 2 weeks, I get that rush of testosterone and I'm like the alpha male, all I want to do is have sex and all this kind of stuff. And then,
well, that's all good for you though. I mean, alpha male and, just getting your prostate, your testosterone back to normal is very good for you. It's actually very healthy. You don't want a low testosterone state. Low testosterone leads to a lot of other problems like heart problems, energy problems, depression problems. There's a lot of problems with low T. And, the cure is actually getting your normal T back, which is your testosterone.
Interesting. Well, I was going to say it's about 2 weeks. I feel like full of testosterone in a sense. All I want to do is have sex and I don't know, I'm horny. And then after 2 weeks, it's just back to normal. I feel the same way I did when I was on the Propecia. So I don't know, maybe for me, it's a low amount of side effect in terms of that.
Well, I mean, I think you go back to like a basal state and then you feel, kind of back to normal. But that doesn't mean that, you should be still on the Propecia. I just feel that Propecia has, very little effect that is kind of helpful. I think there are much better kind of treatments out there now where Propecia just blocks some of the hair loss, but you still have hair loss with Propecia. People still get male pattern baldness with Propecia as well. And I mean, you're really, the treatment is not necessarily Propecia, but, good hair transplantation.
I love that we just jumped into this interview, by the way, Dr. Shusterman. I feel like I should welcome you to the show. I've already been rolling since we started talking.
Excellent.
I'm pretty sure that was clear, but welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. I do appreciate that.
So back to the one question, the leaky faucet. I don't leak urine until after I've gone to the bathroom. It's not like an all-day incontinence kind of thing. Do you recommend I go see a specialist, or is this a normal problem that guys as they age, I'm 37, have, or after you urinate, you can't eliminate all of it or whatever, and you just have this, what I call a leaky faucet afterward?
Well, a lot of it has to be evaluated, so like it's easy for us to talk on the kind of like a podcast about this, but the real issue is not that. It's okay. Well, how much do you hold in your bladder, which we can easily see when you do our testing in the office. We want to know what the residual is, meaning what's still left over after you pee. I'd like to know kind of the size of your prostate, see if that's an issue or factor. We have to get a few more questions down. Age is kind of a very important one. Anyone under the age of 50, we are looking at less of a enlarged prostate problem and more of you could even have prostatitis, which is an inflammation of the prostate, which leads you to go off into the bathroom. So if you're going off into the bathroom, for example, you have a small amount of urine every time you pee. So when you have a small amount of urine every time you pee, you really can't get everything out. Your bladder cannot work well unless you have a decent amount of urine in the bladder. And so that's, so there's a lot of different factors that go into it. I mean, for a urologist who understands this, it's pretty easy, but, it could get somewhat complicated for people who don't really have a lot of understanding. And we do have a lot of technology in my office where we could diagnose what's going on in your bladder. So that's really the important thing. People, a lot of my friends try to ask me questions about, say, peeing. I am the Hamptons bladder doctor. If you kind of look me up, I also had this big article last year about guys needing this procedure that I was talking about because the Hamptons is 3 hours away. And on the way, there's no rest areas, really. So it's hard to stop and get a rest area because the highway has literally no rest areas along to the Hamptons. So it becomes like a Hamptons bladder situation because there's no place to stop and relieve yourself. And so there's a lot of other situations, like boating and things like that, golfing, where it's tough to find a bathroom in the middle of a round. So, there's a lot of good situations where, this kind of procedure that's non-surgical, easy to do and could cure this prostate enlargement is very helpful.
Is the Hamptons bladder problem an official diagnosis in, I don't know, the DSM manual or whatever?
Well, not yet, but, it could be at some point. You know what I mean? Because I saw that there was also, kind of a Catskill bladder problem because some of the Catskill papers picked up on it and said, there's also not a lot of great rest areas on the way up north to the Catskills either. I just happen to be kind of biased because I go to the Hamptons all the time.
All right. Well, I'm in Manhattan, and does your office take United Healthcare insurance for in-network? Because I'm pretty sure I'm going to be seeing you about my problems. I'm kidding, of course.
We accept almost all insurance, just to clarify. So people ask me, do you accept this insurance? And I say, if the insurance pays something, I'd be happy to take it. But, some insurances, which I'm not going to name any names, are insurances by name only. But then when you go to kind of actually submit the claim, there's no reimbursement. So, that's why those insurances I try not to take, but there's very few of those.
It gets even crazier. Like I've had the same company with a different plan negotiated from one employer to another. One employer, they reimbursed everything. The other one, they nickel and dimed me. They wouldn't give me reimbursements for my shrink, like that kind of stuff. So even within the same company, the plans can vary.
Well, no, it's so true. I mean, I have, I'll give you an example. Like I have a Aetna for my company and I didn't realize this before I got this, but there's 12 different plans to choose from. And, it's just, you get paralyzed because you have it's so hard to compare one plan to the other. And actually, it doesn't say, hey, we're going to cover this and not this. So you don't even know, like say you pick a plan and even it could be the most expensive plan and they still don't cover a lot of things.
Don't even get me started because I'm a Canadian living in the United States. I've been here 10 years. And in Canada, there's the single payer, like the government is the only buyer and seller of insurance. And so it's just completely different.
Right.
And there's a whole billion trillion dollar industry that just doesn't exist in that country. But not that there isn't problems with the Canadian system.
But there's good and bad. My sister became a Canadian citizen. She married a Canadian guy. And the problem is she had a knee or ankle problem. She literally could not see a specialist for 6 months. They saw her, they scheduled her for surgery a year from that date.
Yep.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess it's free, except you couldn't use it really. So by the time surgery came up, she goes, my ankle's a little better. I don't think I want to do surgery anymore. So I guess they cured her indirectly through non-treatment. So there you go. That's how they save the money.
It's sort of equally bad for everyone, whereas in the U.S., those who can afford it get the better care, and those who cannot do not. And so it's a little bit of a different system. Both have their upsides, both have their downsides.
Although a lot of Canadian, people with means come down to the States, and it's a big market up by Buffalo area where everyone's. I think Buffalo healthcare became such a big thing because Canadians are coming down.
So in Canada, like the specialists, like if you have a really big problem, they'll operate on you quickly, but they're like, there's a 6-month wait for an MRI.
Right.
And so they'll send you to Buffalo for the MRI. But it's kind of crazy. So people joke there is a 2-tier, there is a public-private system in Canada. All you have to do is take a short flight or drive to the United States, and there you're in the private system.
Which begs the question, why don't they have a similar system as England does, where they also have something similar, but instead of having to fly to some other country, they simply offer private, healthcare, which I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, why not have doctors that accept cash and could do things quicker? And, listen, life is not fair, right?
Yep.
I mean, some women are, very attractive and others are not. Some men are very attractive and others are not. Some men are, very large and others are not. I mean, there's a lot of inequality everywhere. Some people are smarter than others. I'm not saying everyone's smarter, deserves more, but I'm just saying, the system has a way of kind of like stratifying, I think. And, just to deny that there's, like 2 tiers of healthcare anyway, doesn't make any sense, because people will still find good healthcare no matter where they go. I mean, you could be from even if the Europeans who have bad healthcare, they drop, they fly over to Germany and they get great healthcare in Germany. So it's actually an interesting kind of system where, it's like we're trying to put our head in the sand and saying, well, everyone should have the same bad healthcare. And I feel like that's wrong. Everyone should have really good healthcare, but
yes.
But, also some people care about their healthcare more than others. And that's important to understand as well. Everyone thinks, healthcare is important to everyone. And to be honest with you, I see people who just simply don't care. And they're like, look, just make me pee better. And then they never come see me again. Once I make them pee better, they're like, okay, my problem is solved. I don't care about anything else. That's it. So, or the same about erections and other things.
I feel like a good domain name for you for your practice could be makemepeebetter.com.
Hopefully people don't like grab it right now. I'm gonna search for it right away.
So you mentioned not everyone being as lucky as others. I don't want to. I mean, we can get into a big debate about public healthcare. I'm of the belief that the public system in Canada is slightly better because it functions for everybody, perhaps not as well. And then those in Canada who are interested can go to the U.S. There's nothing stopping them. It's not like the government says, no, you can't get healthcare in the U.S. So I'm sort of happy with the way it is now, but I also have the benefit of having good health insurance and living in the U.S. So it's a real position of privilege for me where I get access to the good care in the U.S. and then I point to the Canadian system and say it's better. So I fully acknowledge that I'm a hypocrite.
And by the way, just so you understand this, I don't think any system is better or worse than the other. I think Canadian system would be perfect if it allowed just, doctors to have their private offices set up as well. I think that'll add to the Canadian healthcare system in the way that in England, it's, the same way there. So, and again, I'm not saying American system is perfect. As a matter of fact, we're far from perfect and there was a lot of ways to make it better. But, that's a topic for another day. The problem it really is that I don't think one system is better than the other. We're just neighbors. So we care, this is like first world problems, I would say. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
That's really what I'm looking at. I mean, if you look at say countries like Mexico, where the healthcare is really bad, any system would be good there,
Well, people always ask me, is it much different living in the U.S. to Canada? And I said, well, if you grew up in Canada or you grew up in the U.S., maybe you'd point to certain things, politics, all kinds of things, and you'd say, this is very different. And then I think of someone who grew up in the streets of Mumbai, and to them, someone from a country that's so vastly different, they ask, what's the difference between Canada and the U.S.? And I'll just say nothing. It's basically the same place.
Honestly, I think except for the kind of the government being who they are, kind of one is tied to England more than the other. I mean, we're both tied to England, America and Canada. Let's be honest. I mean, there's such a close alliance, no matter what it is. It's just a different governmental system. I feel like we have a constitution which is a little more helpful here. Like what they did to the truckers last year was so ridiculous. They denied them food. They denied them heat. I mean, and why? Because they were protesting some policies they didn't like. I mean, I'm not sure exactly why you have to punish them to that extent, take away their bank accounts. I mean, these are pretty bad things. And, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of system to rectify the injustices that were done to the truckers. I mean, those those truckers really had a raw deal. I mean, they were working class stiffs without a lot of money, and they were trying to really kind of like really twist the screws on these people.
So interesting to me because it got a lot more coverage in the right-wing American media than it did in Canada, and it got a lot different kind of coverage. And yeah, it's just really strange to me because it wasn't like January 6th. Like, it was a relatively small thing. It lasted a relatively short amount of time. Yeah, and it just got very different. I was working for a Canadian media company at the time, doing a national show at the time.
Were you allowed to kind of probe this situation? I mean, it seems to me that they were suppressing journalists from actually doing journalism because maybe your bank accounts as a journalist would be frozen. You'd be fired.
No.
And bad things would happen to you behind the scenes, which, is a scary, I've been reading this 1984 book, which in a lot of places has been banned for a reason, because George Orwell was a genius. I mean, the guy literally called all the kind of totalitarian policies out, like, 80 years ago, 90 years ago. I mean, the guy literally could foresee what was happening. And they said, if the Soviets could do it, basically everyone could do it. And then if you look at the Soviet system, how they suppressed all dissent and they stayed in power for such a long time, people got great ideas from this Soviet system. And now with the internet, it's getting even worse.
So I was running a late night show. I tried to keep it light. I tried not to do too much political stuff. But to answer your question, could I have covered the trucker rally with any angle that I wanted? I certainly could have. And in fact, there was one conservative host on our network who did. The rest of us hosts are pretty left-leaning, so we covered it in a certain way. But I'm sort of like a Bill Maher liberal. Like, I'm a free-thinking liberal, and I think the left's biggest issue, especially in the U.S., is that it doesn't take the right's criticism of it seriously, because the right's criticism of the left in the U.S. is valid, especially of the media.
Well, I mean, the thing that scares me and is really, it used to be that being a liberal would mean you wanted more to come out. You didn't trust the government. You didn't trust a lot of the systems,
That's the kind of liberal I am, but go on.
Well, but that's what I thought liberalism was. And then they literally hijacked this liberalism to the point where it's not liberalism anymore, in my opinion. It's a completely different term it should be done because, I mean, it's literally like, I would say royalists from a long time ago, where you're like, well, we support, the royalty, no matter what they do, no matter how corrupt they are, no matter, it could be super massive corruption, but, we still support the royals, which was a royalist at that point, which was, we benefit from, a dictatorship kind of system. And we want to continue the dictatorship because we're scared of having the people actually make decisions. And that's really the scary part. I mean, when you hear the government talk about like, we're going to make the decisions for the people, like, for example, what happened in the, in the run up to the election with Hillary Clinton, where she was essentially the only candidate on the Democratic side. Bernie Sanders supporters were not allowed, did not have a fair shake at it, and I think it's very clear from these leaked emails, I mean, whatever way these emails were leaked, I mean, it shows a lack of concern for Democratic voters. And that's the scary part. And it's not just Democratic voters. If the Republicans did the same, I would be equally upset. And as a matter of fact, they tried with Donald Trump to actually make sure he doesn't get the nomination, but in the end, they failed. But the Democrats tried and succeeded because they were overwhelmingly anti Bernie Sanders, even though in reality, if you look at the real numbers, I think Bernie Sanders would have easily won had it not been a rigged system.
And if you look at what a liberal is, what a leftist is, like, that's an ideal candidate. He didn't get a fair shake, and I agree with you.
Exactly. And not only that, I mean, this is what the Democratic voters wanted. They didn't want Hillary Clinton, which is why she lost. And the interesting thing is that the Democrats have only themselves to blame. And they were blaming Russia, and it was everyone else, not themselves, right? Russia told the truth about them, so they're to blame, and now we need to kind of punish Russia somehow.
The same can be said for the 2020 election, where it was like the right is blaming everybody but themselves for the loss of.
Exactly. And this is the problem with our political system right now. No one wants to blame what actually happened. And, there's a lot of causes for what happened in 2020. And I think that, the easy way to kind of get out of it is like, voting machines were to blame, this were to blame, that was to blame. And, in reality, we knew about all these things before the election, and then only after the election, when it was clear that, that Biden won, is now it becomes like, okay, well, is it a real fair election? So, I'm a libertarian, so I don't care in either party. Actually, I just like when government is less in my face about stuff. I think people could decide for themselves how to live. I mean, I think, society is very good at adapting to, kind of the cultural norms at the time. But when politicians try to get in there and change the course of things, that's where I think it's a problem.
I've having lived in the U.S. for 10 years and watching how a dysfunctional larger government is. I completely agree. I don't have the same political views as you, but I do agree that the way that the American behemoth of government, both at the state level and federal level, just is completely incompetent with the simplest stuff. Like I took a when I was living in California, I took a paper written driver's test in 2012. When I got my license in Canada, like in the early 2000s, it was a touchscreen computer. It's a stupid little example, but there was someone there grading paper tests on a government salary, and I just couldn't believe it. But I want to rewind to what you said about the media and being able to express an opinion, because there's this wonderful interview with Noam Chomsky, who's a pretty far leftist, but also a free thinker and also deeply critical of every government party in the U.S. and the left and the right in the U.S., where he's being interviewed by this, I think, BBC reporter. And the BBC reporter goes on the offensive saying, this is my show. I can say what I want. You're telling me every journalist is controlled and they're being told what to say by these big media companies. And here I am. I came up with this question. I can ask you what I want. What you're saying about journalists is wrong. And then Noam Chomsky says, I agree with you. I agree that you think you can say what you want. But I can tell you this right now, if you weren't parroting what these big media companies want you to say, you wouldn't be sitting in this chair with this show being able to ask me the question. And so in that way, you're controlled. And the reporter didn't even know how to respond to it because Noam Chomsky was right. And so having worked in the big media game, even as an overnight host, even doing a comedy show, even doing like fun stuff where I wasn't even that political, I did feel a pressure to cover things with a certain angle.
Well, conform to what they want you to say. Because if you make a joke or say about a protected class of people, which never used to be this way, the fun jokes are from these quote unquote protected class of people. And that's how you change how people think about it in a funny way. I feel like, like humor emphasizes the weird stuff that happens and it improves your understanding of like, is this really something that we should care about as much, because that's really where I think, the left is really kind of, with these protected classes, things you can't say. It's really like in the book 1984. I mean, they literally changing dictionary. They're changing, they're going after people for their political views. I mean, this is all in, the book, which again, I'm not trying to promote the book in any way.
No, it's a great book. We read it in school as kids in Canada.
But, watch that movie again, and then you'll realize that whatever, the interesting thing about the book was the guy was a leftist, right? He was a communist, and even his own system that he likes, this communist system or, socialist system, he's actually showing what a socialist system gone wrong has become, in these like three countries that are in this, film or book 1984. So it is a very kind of a cool way to kind of understand what happens, with political parties. They start out with great intentions, great ideas, and then they kind of decompensate into like, how do we control all debate so that no one could think for themselves anymore?
And so on its face, I was allowed to say or do whatever I want. I could cover whatever I want. I had wide berth, but behind the scenes, even for me doing like a fun show, I felt pressure. I can't imagine what the daytime primetime drive shows where they're doing real like Canadian political stuff, hardcore, that kind of pressure. And in that way, I think reporters are controlled in the West. I don't think they're controlled by big companies saying, write this. It's more an implied pressure that if you didn't conform to it, you wouldn't have the job in the first place because you would never have been offered the job. In this way, I think things are controlled. I agree with Noam Chomsky.
Well, interestingly, you could see now about Tucker Carlson. I mean, the guy is the number one talk show host in America, generating, massive amount of money for Fox News all across the spectrum. And even he was canned. And then his remarks afterwards are very to your point, where he literally says, like, we really, I don't want to work for anyone. I want to be independent, because if you work for someone, you literally have to conform to what they want you to say. So pharmaceutical industry, for example, is the number one supporter of like cable news shows. Mm-hmm. So if you're critical of any, pharma company, you're really in danger of deplatforming yourself, because they need these pharma money to survive. And simply, just even saying, is the vaccine good for everyone? I mean, vaccine may be good, and it is good, I think. However, to say it's good for, say, 2-year-old kids or 5-year-old kids or 10-year-old kids, I mean, that's a big stretch, because those were not the target group of COVID. So anyway, I don't want to kind of get into the vaccine issue, but
no, I love that we're doing this, by the way. Like, this is why I do this show. I mean, we can talk about penis enlargements, and we should, but please go on.
But the only thing I care about really is having like a very smart, like, debate about what is good, and to say everyone should be vaccinated, and there's no debate about it, whether you've had COVID, whether you're at risk for dying, or, it to me, by silencing any other opinions, we're relying on one person who's also very fallible. Dr. Fauci, he's a great guy, and I'm sure he does mean very well. The problem is you're a great guy, you mean well, but you're not the ultimate answer in everything. And to have one guy dictate how the policy should be run doesn't make any sense. And, basically the media said, if you don't have the same view as Fauci, identical word for word, we will censor you and deplatform you and make sure you can't talk. And again, I don't know if that's the right way to handle the situation. I think it's much better to just actually hear from other doctors. And, if I'm saying a completely outlandish opinion, other doctors will say, listen, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And, and it makes a lot of sense. That's called scientific debate.
So in securities law, if there's a run on a bank, or a bank fails and the FDIC steps in, there's a media ban. Like, you're not allowed to publish about it until it's settled and the FDIC restructures it. And the reason for that is they don't want to create more panic, which will cause more of a bank run, which could be more risky to the financial system. But it is just crazy amounts of censorship. Like, you can't talk about a bank collapsing until after the dust is settled, while the FDIC is figuring it out. And the reason for it is like public financial security. And so I do think during a public health emergency, silencing dissidents, however draconian it seems, isn't the worst idea.
Well, hold on for a second. When you're talking about you're talking about your health though, and without an information, it's like, listen, pretend I'm your doctor now. Would you want my viewpoint and just to say, the only view you can have is surgery. You can't watchful wait. You can just have surgery. And, again, surgery is the safest, but I have options. I'm a human being. I don't have to conform to, especially when it comes to my own health, on a vaccine that we know as a fact, you can't even have, say, the vaccine causes you harm. The makers of the vaccine are completely immune from any kind of lawsuits. I mean, this is, and then the other thing, which is really terrible, is that the government bought all the dosing. So now the government has all the incentives to push the vaccine on people. Yeah. And that's my question. The question is not, listen, my mom had it. I encouraged her to get the vaccine. A lot of my older patients, I said, you have to get the vaccine. It's better for your health. I mean, I was very into the vaccine, except when my kids came home from school and they said, for us to go on a trip, we need to be vaccinated. And to me, that's absurd. So a kid who's like 13 or 14, has zero risk from COVID is not, and who probably had COVID, like some form, which means he has immunity now. I mean, I don't think he was sick with the actual COVID, but, they probably were exposed to it. They fought it off. And now everyone needs 10 doses of the vaccine that doesn't kill anyone in their age group. So that's where my question was.
It's a fine question, and there's some validity to it, but I'm saying for just like with the FDIC rules, for a short period of time when there's a public health emergency, sort of silencing people who are saying, no, don't participate in this remedial action that will save lives for an extremely short period of time, just like martial law. For example, if a country invaded the U.S. and the government declared martial law because there was foreign soldiers on the soil and they were just like arresting anyone who was aiding the foreign soldiers, whether they were guilty or not, for an extremely short period of time, these tools are useful for a government and I think necessary. But to concede to your point in some sense, the amount of time that went on was way too long.
Well, it's over 2 years is my next point. Was at some point, and even now, there's a hesitation to kind of revisit what happened and to see how we can improve in the future. I mean, I think that's what you do with history. I mean, I feel like I'm a student of history because we're bound to repeat history if we don't kind of take lessons from it. So, I mean, I think the lessons, learned from COVID, hopefully, resonate with a lot of these politicians. I mean, I feel like, unfortunately, during times of stress and upheaval, the people that win tend to be politicians. And if you look at and not only that, very rich people, because if you look at the kind of the amount of stratification now, it's worse than before COVID by a significant amount. And I think that the rich got richer, and unfortunately, the poor who are told that they can't work for, months and years, actually turned out really bad. So, I mean, I just feel like, it makes sense to kind of revisit what happened and look at it and say, could we change things in the future? Because, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be another public health emergency at some point.
I agree with you. It does make sense. And I also love that we're having this conversation. Next time you criticize the left for being unable to even have a debate, like, I think Tucker Carlson's an idiot. I think the truckers had a stupid message. I was very pro-vaccine. I vote socialist in Canada, NDP. And yet I'm loving talking about all this stuff with you. You're a completely rational guy. Some of the things you said I don't agree with at all, but I'm loving this.
By the way, I like having a debate. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying that this is a viewpoint that I think is fair to have, and I think if you don't have opposing viewpoints, it becomes an echo chamber, and the echo chamber leads to even more kind of unitary, kind of like just one mind thinking. And you don't want even within a political party there should be a debate. I mean, I don't think that there should be, okay, well, this is one size fits all for us. And if you don't agree with every single message, that means you're not part of our party anymore. That to me, that's not inclusive and doesn't make any sense. I mean, just because you have dissent on a few issues doesn't mean you're some kind of a bad socialist, for example. Like if you say, you know what, I'm a young guy, I don't think I needed the vaccine. That's just an example. I don't even care about this issue as much. It's whatever is done. We can't undo the past. The point I'm making is they say, the government should not rule how like a woman could take care of her own body, right? Or woman has right to choose.
Yeah.
And I feel like that should be true of pretty much everything. I mean, you really shouldn't mandate things. You can give a great, kind of like a very, like Fauci could go on TV and say, listen, if you don't do it, you're going to die. And he did. And he said that numerous times, and he scared the hell out of a lot of people, which is fine. Again, the point is that if there's no counterbalance, then, people get upset when the truth comes out, because all the time, truth eventually does come out. And, the way to handle it is not to say everyone who's telling the truth should shut up, because, there was a public health emergency 3 years ago, and then, now we can't judge people based on what the facts that we know. And we actually can judge people, because when things come out and makes them look like, they did the wrong decisions, people should be held to account. It should, just because you thought it was good at the time doesn't mean that it's still good, kind of a few years later. And, again, I think everyone, should be, and maybe it's true that, maybe they did what's best and we should kind of forgive whatever the problem was. But, really, when people are censoring any opposing viewpoint, the people who had the right viewpoint are going to be like, well, we weren't even allowed to say the truth, or something that was not what was approved by the government. So that's really what it comes down to. But I agree, as far as certain things like banking, I mean, you want to protecting the public is kind of not creating more of a bank run, for example. So that is protecting the public. But then to say, we know how to protect the public and everyone must take a vaccine that we don't know any of the side effects because the vaccine is brand new and wasn't really tested, that's really the problem. I mean, I really thought that, with an untested, unproven vaccine, that people would be a little more cautious with it. And yes, I mean, older people that clearly would benefit from it should get the vaccine. I would never deny older people the vaccine because they should be getting it. But to say that there's no choice in anyone, whether to take it or not. I'll give you another example. What if someone just wanted to stay in the house and never wanted to go out and just were like locking themselves up? Do they need the vaccine? I mean, they really shouldn't be contacting anyone else. So,
well, no one was forced to have it. There was just a lot of consequences at the time, like you couldn't travel, couldn't go into the office, a lot of negative consequences, which
means they take away your livelihood. And I mean, it's
sure, but you're talking about a shut-in. I mean, that person those consequences wouldn't affect them. So no, they don't need to take it, kind of thing.
No. I totally understand. But what if they want to travel to some other state and then shut themselves in at that point? I mean, again, the point is not the point is that, trying to put a lot of barriers in the way of people who, like, again, if it was something that was proven and there was more data on it, and I could see where it makes more sense to kind of have more mandates. Like, we know certain vaccines for kids, for example, like MMR, for example, is fairly safe. I mean, very, very small percentage of people have side effects, and not giving it to the vast majority of people would lead to more consequences that are worse for kids. So we could see that debate because, we see both sides clearly now. And, those companies, if they make bad vaccines, are held liable for them because, they've been tested. I mean, when you have data out there.
I think the logic was similar to what I was saying. It's a public health emergency. That was the logic, although I think the execution, and I think that logic is sound. However, I'm in agreement with you that the execution, especially in the U.S., also in Canada, was a nightmare and done terribly.
Right. And that's my point. My point is that there's merit to what you're saying. I mean, listen, I'm a doctor. I want what's good for the public health. The issue is that there's always a debate. Okay, what is good for the public health, and who gets to decide that? And that's really the issue. It's like, okay, Fauci is one source, but then there's plenty of other sources that were disagreeing with him, and that's really where I have an issue. Where it's if you just bring out one specialist and he has one inclination or one viewpoint, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or wrong. And I mean, I agree with you in that people who are, alarmed or saying things that were obviously untrue or misleading, that's one thing. But then to have just even stating certain statistics would get you banned from certain platforms, which were correct statistics. So when you state certain statistics, they don't. Certain, media companies, they didn't want you to hear certain things that were just actual facts, which is a little bit of that's where I'm like.
Yeah, I don't know any specifics about that. I'll just take you at your word and believe that happened. But I was thinking, like, why is the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration or whatever it is, they're apparently run like the best government department in the world. They're like a shining example of an effective government department. And the reason that flights are so safe, not just in the US, but around the globe, is they set the standard, the example. And then the Securities Commission, decent. FDIC, we were talking about, I mean, that's a small commission, but it's a really critical function when banks fail. Why are some government agencies run really well and others a nightmare?
Well, I think that the FAA, I mean, there's really not a lot of politics in flying safe. You know what I mean?
I suppose not, but there shouldn't be a lot of politics in public health either.
Well, I agree, except the problem with it was that it, in some ways might have decided the last election. You know what I'm saying? Because of mail-in balloting, where it requires basically in the United States, it required basically no photo ID or anything. I mean, if you got a mail-in ballot from anywhere, like even if you opened up someone else's mailbox, you saw a public, you could basically vote just by getting a ballot.
You could, but there wasn't a lot of evidence, like a hard proven evidence that widespread fraud was happening. It was just a claim that was made.
Here's the only evidence I could cite is pretty simple evidence, right? This is as simple as it can get, and I think is very damning. So Donald Trump in 2016 got significantly less amount of vote than in 2020. So Donald Trump's vote count went up by 4 to 5 million. And then the problem is, and this is where a lot of people if you just look at overall statistics, Biden's vote count was more than Obama by 4 to 5 million. So Obama, who was the first Black president, got more votes and was much more of an inspirational candidate. He got less votes than, say, Biden, who didn't really do any political rallies, didn't really go out and actually campaign. And the interesting thing is, how did Biden get that many more votes than Obama? And that's really something that's very hard to explain, to be honest with you.
That's not evidence, and you're falling victim.
I'm not talking about evidence. I'm just simply saying, let me give you another example. Mail-in ballots, the only way you could tell a mail-in ballot is legit is through the case, is through the envelope. If the envelope on the mail-in ballot gets thrown away, for example, then the evidence gets thrown away. So you only have a ballot. On our U.S. ballots, you're not allowed to have names or identifying information on a U.S. ballot because we're supposed to vote anonymously. But the problem is that when you vote anonymously and they take away all the kind of you could have voted anonymously 30 times, and that's really the problem.
With all due respect, I think you're falling victim to a logical fallacy. It's called the argument from personal incredulity. That's when you can't think of any explanation but one for why something happened. Therefore, your explanation is correct. And that is not how proving things works. And there's another thing. These electronic voting machines could have been hacked in 2016. There's so many avenues for fraud.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying that the 2016 election was legitimate either. I'm simply saying that the thing I'm saying is we need to make sure the elections are fairly done if it's going to decide on political power. And if they're not fairly done, then there's really no real political system anymore. It's more of a dictatorship run by oligarchs, really.
Why don't you think mail-in ballots are fair? For example, they exist for folks in the military. They exist for folks who are infirm and can't leave the home. They're sick,
Correct.
They're elder, they're traveling. Why in those cases is it fair, but when it's mass mail-in voting because of a pandemic, it's all of a sudden not fair?
Because what happens is that, say you're not going to be able to make it, you request a mail-in ballot. So people would requesting the mail-in ballot. It would be sent to them on request. It wouldn't be sent to them.
Yeah, but anybody could make that request fraudulently. The avenues from fraud are just the same.
Actually, completely wrong, because to register for voting for a vote in the state, you have to have proof that you're a eligible voter. I mean, we just don't let anyone register to vote. And that's really the problem is once you're registered to vote, you go online or you go in person and you request a mail-in ballot, we know you're registered to vote. And that's how you got the ballot in the first place. And that's my point is that, we already know you're a voter, at which point, if you just send in ballots across the board, you can, that's easy to kind of harvest everyone's ballot and then basically fraudulently send in votes that were not actually the opinion of the person that actually got the vote, the ballot. And a lot of our ballots are also susceptible to, mass reproduction, for example. There's no identifying information on a ballot that says that it's an authentic ballot. I mean, we have printers right now.
Well, it's state to state, and there's probably a serial number on the envelope the ballot's sent in. So I'm not sure that's correct. But
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're saying is correct either. That's the problem. The problem is that when you have a serial issue, like in some counties in America, there were more votes than people living there, and people were saying, well, that's okay, but again, that raises a lot of questions, and
sure,
a lot of the questions were never really answered. And if you look at when you said there's no definitive evidence, I mean, it's true, except that when you're looking at all these cases that came up, most of them were thrown out because they were like, well, it's too late now. It's after the election. So the actual purpose of the courts was to look at, okay, was it a legitimate election? They said, we don't have jurisdiction over whether it was legitimate or not. And that's really the problem is, a lot of people in the media says, oh, well, there's never been a case out there that proves anything. And the facts of the matter are that when you're looking at numbers that just simply don't make sense because ballots were sent to people indiscriminately.
More people voting than the previous election is an explanation. I mean, you're saying 5 million more votes for Biden than the previous election with Obama, or 2 elections ago with Obama. I don't know how that could have happened. Therefore, my explanation is correct, and that's not like a causal link.
No, that's not what I'm not saying that the election was illegitimate right now. I'm simply saying we have to look at what happened and see if there are ways to fix it. I'm just saying that just recreating what happened in the last election, which I know some people want to do because it led to some political victory. I mean, ultimately what's going to happen is no election is going to be legit anymore moving forward because the right is going to do the same as the left. And then when the right wins, the left is going to say the same thing that the right is saying right now. And that's really the problem. I mean, again, when you win, you say, okay, I'm going to sweep everything under the rug. And we should never do that. That's my point. I'm not saying we should revisit and we should try to overthrow the government. Obviously not. I mean, I benefit from a stable government. No one wants to overthrow the government, unless you're completely out of your mind. But the point is that, if we're built as a democracy, which we are, we should really have a legitimate democracy, meaning people should be able to believe that the elections are 100% on the level. And if you just say, well, if you believe that the election somehow doesn't make sense, you're a kook and crazy. I mean, there's some legitimate evidence to say.
Well, I haven't called you that.
No, but I'm saying people are being called that simply because there's some suspicion that again, suspicion is a good thing. People want to look into, people were suspecting that Russia, which is completely disproven, stole the 2016 election. I'm just saying, simply, I didn't believe in that. I thought that was crazy too, just not because I was right wing or left wing.
What about the Mueller report that was presented to Congress that completely disagreed with what you're saying?
Basically stated nothing. It just basically stated that some companies that were linked to Russia spent, I don't know, $20,000 on ads on Facebook. Now, again, we spend a lot more. The CIA spends trillions of dollars on ads all around the world to regulate certain elections. And so to say that Russia is not allowed to spend any money. Now, I'm not saying it's the right thing for governments to do. I'm not trying to say, but if we're doing it to the tune of billions all around the world, and then Russia spends, I don't know, less than $1 million on trying to kind of sow discontent in America, which, I mean, again, that's to benefit them politically. But then to say that the entire election was stolen when, Hillary Clinton spent $500 million. So with $500 million, she couldn't prove her point.
Well, it's different because that's someone in the country. That's an American spending money to influence the public as opposed to a foreign state.
But what about the CIA when they...
I'm not a fan of the CIA's interference with global politics. I'm agree with you there.
I totally agree, but I'm saying I don't want to be a whataboutism. I'm just simply saying that if that was kind of the only thing, then pretty much every election that the CIA spent money on was illegitimate also, which is basically every election.
The claim was the Russians got wise to some of these modern tactics to influence public, and it was demonstrable that it happened in the U.S. and that potentially swayed voters. That was the whole claim, and to me, the report confirmed that claim. I've taken up an hour of your time. This has been an incredible conversation.
Well, I'm happy we're having a conversation about it because, again, What I'm trying to say simply is not that that I believe that anything has been illegitimate. I just want to make sure that, in the future, that everyone could like rest easy, both right and left wing, because there's going to be change in who wins, throughout history.
Yeah.
That both parties could sit back and say, you know what, this has been a legitimate election. We're happy with it. And we're not going to blame Russia. We're not going to blame voting machines. We're not going to blame mail-in ballots.
It goes even further than that both parties and both groups of voters should sit back and say, hey, I can work with you. I don't agree with you on certain points. I can concede them. I can, you're in power right now. You pass some legislation that annoys me. Fine. But like, I can work with you. I can talk with you. I can have discourse with you. I can empathize with you. I can see things from your point of view. Like, that is what the U.S. is missing right now.
I think you're 100% right. And I think a lot of that is because both parties are kind of dissatisfied with the leadership, because both leaders of both parties really, they talk a good game in certain ways before the election, and when the election happens and say one party wins, they really don't fulfill the promises that they're claiming to fulfill. That's really and I'm talking from both sides, because I think both the right and left are basically one political party. Unfortunate, but true. I mean,
I always say it's the corporation party that likes gay people and the corporation party that hates gay people. That's kind of my joke about the U.S. system.
I totally agree. Like there's someone, the corporations, for example, Sam Bankman-Fried contributed to both parties. Like he said, I'm a Democrat, but I contributed to both because I didn't know whoever got into power, I wanted to make sure to influence them. So
the establishment is working for me because I'm incredibly wealthy and have a lot of power. I'm supporting the establishment. I think that's what someone says when they support both parties.
Exactly, because they don't really care one way or another. I mean, it doesn't matter like who wins. The question is do I have influence in that government? And that's really, unfortunate but true. And I mean, again, that's why I like populist candidates, because they literally, and I'm talking about like Bernie Sanders also, I'm talking about basically anyone who is there and because they have actual beliefs and they care about, the system, and they want to make a positive change, and what we could debate whether that's a good change or a bad change or whatever, that's up for debate. But the issue really is that people should be able to vote on that and have an opportunity to see if what people are saying actually is able to kind of benefit them. So that's why I say, like, I think at this point we really don't have as good of a system as we think. We think our system is perfect. The problem is that as you could see with the Podesta emails, that even political parties are trying to influence their voters and rig an election basically to make sure that one candidate won over another. And that's a political party. I mean, we really shouldn't have political parties deciding, that. I mean, the political party should allow voters to decide which way they run.
Political parties are dictatorships. There's nothing in terms of the internal governance of a party. There's no rules. They can do it, not that I agree with that, but that's why you end up seeing shady stuff like that that's perfectly legal.
Well, but that's because voters don't know. But then voters start knowing, then that's where there's like a lot of disenfranchisement. Because
sure.
This is where I feel like a lot of voters don't like to vote, because whatever they vote, it's kind of like rigged anyway, So you vote for one candidate, but it's like been rigged already to make sure that candidate loses.
I posed a question earlier, like, why are some government agencies good? And you said, flights. There's nothing political about aviation safety. And my what I posed at the time was, I don't think there's anything inherently political about health. But the reason it's become so political is because of it's become a cash industry because of pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, which for me is the reason I like the Canadian system, is those aren't massive in Canada. There is no insurance company presence, or it's relatively minor. And pharmaceutical companies kind of leave Canada alone because it's so heavily regulated and costs are cheaper and they can't really profit as much. And for that reason, I kind of like that system. Healthcare shouldn't be that political, but I think it got politicized in Canada because of the American influence, which is, I think, why you end up with the trucker rally, which I don't agree with, but I will agree with this. Like, it was handled badly. But yeah, that's kind of my thought.
I just feel like, truckers should be a protected group because they don't make a lot of money. They don't have a lot of political influence. And I really think that journalists should really care. And I feel like this is why the first tenet of our Constitution in America is that we have freedom of the press. And that's really, what the founding fathers really cared about the most, because if you're allowed to hear certain information, you can make your own decision. The problem is that what you said in the beginning, which is basically that it wasn't covered correctly by journalists. And I think a lot of the journalists really just, because of their political leanings, didn't even want to cover it.
You can finish your point, but I didn't quite say it wasn't covered correctly. I don't agree with that, but please keep going.
Oh, okay. I thought you said that, a lot of the journalists weren't as interested about it because of their political bias.
No, I just said it didn't get the kind of coverage in the Canadian media as it did by the American right media.
Right. And I think, but you did say that a lot of the people who are covering the situation are left leaning, and
except on the network and station that I was on, there was one host that was right wing who was very much in support of it, and he wasn't deplatformed. But you know what? It was kind of like a little mini Fox News show on our generally liberal network, which I think is good. Like, I love that host; he's the nicest guy in the world.
And by the way, why is that not allowable? I mean, even Fox News should have.
It should be. It should be.
Yeah, like I feel like Tucker should be on the left network, and then Rachel Maddow should be on a right network. I mean, I really think that
I agree with you.
I mean, there's room for people having different opinions, and doesn't like I watch Rachel Maddow, and I don't agree with her a lot of what she says, but doesn't mean that I'm like I don't want to watch her, and that somehow because I disagree with her politically that she's unwatchable. I mean, I think it's actually wrong to say that. I mean, if she's entertaining, that's what we tune in for, right? And I like getting viewpoints challenged. I think that's critical. Otherwise you don't develop how you think, and you don't always have to follow the orthodoxy, and that's the thing. I try not to be one party or another. I try to just be like what is called libertarian, which I think is just you think about every situation, you analyze it, and you say, okay, what's the best way to think about it from my perspective, which is less government is better, and so I'm like, all right, how do we get away with less government in someone's life?
For me, it's how do we make government where it should help people efficient and not wasteful. And I think if the U.S. government helped folks and didn't let folks bleed on the street and incarcerate all these people and waste so much money throwing them in jail, so much money.
Right.
Like, you could house someone for a fraction of the cost to incarcerate them, and then you could give them a decent life. Not a great life, but a decent. I think that if the U.S. government was efficient and effective about the way it spends its massive amounts of money, every libertarian would become a socialist. Like, if you could have, healthcare done effectively, if you could have housing people who are in need, if you could have a welfare system that was effective and efficient, like, I don't think as many folks on the right would have an issue with helping others spending government money as they do now.
Well, I feel like once a crisis is solved, they don't look for actual solutions to problems anymore. And that's really because, really, I mean, certain people have been campaigning for many years about like high crime in certain cities. And, no matter what they campaign, the crime rate never really goes down. As a matter of fact,
because it suits them with it being high.
Right. And they keep blaming it on the same factors every 4 years. And you're like, well, like at some point, when are we going to fix the problem? Because the issue really is that, it's been brought up for, I remember since the 80s, and again, before that, I don't remember because I was too young at that point. But I'm sure it was in the 70s, too, that the crime rate was massive in New York City, for example.
Yeah.
And it's the same issue every 4 years. And it's the same arguments every 4 years. And really, I don't see really a good fix in place, like where it's really been fixed.
Dr. David Shusterman, I really appreciate you coming here. It took a lot of patience for me not to interrupt some of the things you were saying because I disagreed with them, but I'm very glad you got a chance to share your opinion.
Well, and me the same, actually. I try not to interrupt as well.
You're a urologist. You do penis injections. You do it all. Where can people find your practice?
Well, it's in New York City. I'm at nyurology.com. So, we don't talk any politics in my office. So, I try to talk about just science of the penis. I try to be a high-tech urologist, which means I want to know information before I start treating. So we do we could do like ultrasound testing, urine testing, blood testing. Everything could be done right from the office. And that's how we figure everything out, because I like to know things before I start treating them. So one of the things that I like to know about is, how your bladder's doing, how your kidneys are doing. So we check, and everything in urology is actually internal, pretty much everything. So the whole urinary system is internal. So of course, we can't operate to look inside like you would a sink. But what we do have is imaging that we can kind of get in there and kind of figure out like the size of your prostate, any kidney stones, anything that's in the bladder that can be a problem, for example. So, we kind of see what's happening, and we stratify people based on symptoms, what we find on imaging and testing. And then, we come up, again, one of the things that been tenet of my practice is also just simply minimally invasive kind of procedure. So the less invasive is what I prefer. And if we could get away with non-surgical intervention, then we do that. And so, my whole focus in my practice is kind of modernizing urology and making it like as technologically advanced and state of the art as possible. And so that's where I feel like I've been, making inroads.
I'm sure you have. And that was ostensibly why you came here, to talk about that and injections and cosmetic procedures. But to me, this was so much more interesting, and what I love about this medium. You're a great guy. I enjoyed chatting with you, and thanks for taking the time.
Same. And I look forward to talking to you again. If you have me on again, I'd be happy to get you back.
I would love to have you back. I consider you a fantastic guest. I really do appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, and I love the way you do your the podcast. I think your way is perfect. It's just you ask the right questions, let people talk, and then you say a lot of things that I agree with. Even though sometimes politically we don't agree, I think most of the stuff that you did say I do agree with, and I think there is a balance there between government that is kind of efficient and helpful. And if we can have that, of course, everyone would love it.
Yeah.
The problem is that it's been, it's been many times in the past. So we've been hoping for it for a long time, and it just simply doesn't come as often. And I know everyone keeps saying, well, it's not because it hasn't been implemented right. And so, at some point, I'd like to see implementation that works. So, I totally agree. At some point, people give up hope and say, you know what, no matter how many times I try to implement something, it doesn't work. At some point, you got to say, okay, maybe we let the free market decide a little more, and, kind of set up a rules-based system and let the free market decide more than, say, a centralized agency that, sometimes doesn't have public interest at heart.
I don't think I would have agreed with that sentiment until I lived in the U.S. for 11 years. And now I'm starting to see it more, because I see how inefficient this government is compared to others. And I think it might just be due to size. Like there's more people in California than there are in the whole of Canada. So it's very easy to run things and run programs that hand out money to help people a little better. And when you have such a massive country, I can't help but to think the only way it's going to get better is if you break it up into smaller, divisible, administratable units.
I totally agree. And as a matter of fact, the founders of this country also thought the same, where they didn't want a federal government that was too strong. And that's the issue, is when the federal government's too strong. There's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse that happens because the federal government gets a bulk of our tax money. If you look at our tax revenue, the federal government gets, 2/3 of all tax revenue basically goes to the federal government. So they have a lot of money to play with, and they try to dole it out.
They spend it on stupid shit. Yes, we can swear. It's a podcast.
Right. I would say things that sometimes don't make sense, or are politically driven, or are donor driven, or something that doesn't make sense to me. I think, and again, maybe I'm foolish about it because I'm only a doctor. I'm not a politician or anything, but
maybe you should run for office.
Yeah, you know what? I have more interest in just kind of medical practice and maybe like criticizing than I do actually being criticized.
It's much easier to criticize. And if I did vote for you, I could do 10 years in prison because I'm just a green card holder. I'm not a naturalized U.S. citizen.
Right. Which, that's where, if you request a ballot and they send you one, maybe.
If I don't get caught, I voted fraudulently. If I do get caught, I'm looking at 10 years and deportation.
Right. And that's my point. And my point is that seems like, we should make that system a little better so that it's harder to commit fraud if you want to.
I'm a foreign national. I'm a resident alien. I'm legally present here in this country. The idea of voting, given the potential penalty for it, even if there's a fraction of a chance I'll get caught, is so insanely prohibitive. When you're a permanent resident, there are very few deportable crimes. When you're a visa holder, like any crime can get you deported, and any crime can exclude you from becoming a green card holder. But once you have the green card, it's pretty tough for the U.S. government to get rid of you, and you are entitled to a trial. So if they deny me entry at the border, they can't kick me out. They can hold me pending a trial. Now, if they say, do you want to leave free or do you want to wait 6 months in jail for a trial? What am I going to do? I'm going to go back to Canada. But according to the law, they can't get rid of me. There are very few crimes where they can, and voting is one of them. And that's after you do it depends where you are, but up to 10 years in prison. I can't imagine the logic of a resident alien or an undocumented alien wanting to vote. So I'm very puzzled, unless it's just like a company or a malicious actor, but actual individuals voting, I would be in that class of potential illegal voters. I couldn't imagine why I would want to do that.
Well, I mean, to that note, I mean, the fact is that, a lot of what we were talking about just is something that unnerves people. And sometimes, statistics can be used to kind of look at what the situation is. I think it's going to be an interesting next election to see how many people vote in this next election. If you see a big drop off of, millions of votes for a certain political party, start thinking, especially if there are similar candidates run again, because we're seeing that Biden's ahead of the polls and Trump is ahead of the polls. So it's kind of an interesting thing, if they tighten the screws on kind of this kind of free balloting where everyone could get a ballot in the mail and you don't have to even request it. And when you send it in, there's no photo ID requirements or no ID requirements whatsoever, actually. And so, if that gets tightened down and then all of a sudden you start seeing that the numbers go back to normal where it was in the 2016 election, you start wondering, okay, what happened in 2020? And then that's really where that may be more of the proof that we're looking for kind of over time, because time, like I said in the past, I think, initially in the thick of things, it's hard to prove, but then over time it becomes easier to prove because certain statistics and numbers start coming out in next elections, and you start saying, it's kind of an interesting one-timer. But it also could be that if there's a free, like a fair, like some election that could be a little more supervised and monitored, and Biden comes out with the same vote count, then you would say, you know what? It was a completely legit election in 2020. So, I mean, listen, I just think that we got to look into kind of what happens in the next election and see where it's going to stand,
I mean, the runners, Trump especially, he's already saying it's going to be fraudulent. So he's already kind of poisoning the well. I'm not saying he's poisoning you, but he's poisoning the well for people to mistrust it.
He's poisoning the well in that he wants to make sure, the only way to make sure the next election is going to be more on the level is to actually point out, like, look, we need to really have protections in place that protect people. You can't just say, well, it's racist to show IDs. That's not racist. When you go to, when you went to a restaurant and you needed to show an ID to get into the restaurant, they didn't say it was racist to show your health ID.
No, but what if polls show that certain groups of people, when forced to have an ID, are less likely to vote, and those groups are of a particular group?
It's kind of an interesting thing because, I think that it depends on how you ask the polls and what you say. A lot of polls could be driven.
I'm not saying that is the outcome of a poll, but I'm saying if there were, how would you interpret that?
Well, I would say if there was a poll out there saying, look, would you rather have fair elections with IDs, whether you're right or left, or unfair elections without IDs, because anyone could show up and vote without an ID. And the question then is I think most people, if you say, look, it depends, if you say, it's racist to ask for IDs, then certain groups really believe it's racist to ask for IDs. I mean, that's crazy, though.
I'm not making that claim, but I'll say this. I'm of the belief I'd rather have a more accessible election with the risk of a slight amount of fraud, as opposed to deny a legitimate voter, to deny a U.S. citizen a vote. But in the process of getting rid of that small fraction of a fraud, you disenfranchise a bunch of folks because they can't get access to voting. They won't get access. It's too difficult for them.
Let's say not photo ID. Let's just say any ID, work ID, or even like a utility bill. But, the interesting thing is that
But that doesn't prove citizenship, because I have all those things. I have a New York State driver's license. I could vote with those things.
Oh, I totally agree. By the way, you have to be on the voter roll. You have to prove you're a citizen to be on the voter roll. So it's not like, so they have to have an ID, some sort of ID, to get on the voter roll in the first place. You can't, like, say you're homeless, you have no papers, and you're nowhere in the system. You can't just vote.
At the DMV, when I exchanged my California license for a New York license, they just asked me, "Do you want to register for vote?" And and it's like yes or no, and I'm like, and then there's a little thing saying if you're not a citizen, don't tick yes.
Well, if you tick yes, what happens is that you will get. That's how they find out very easily that because I mean it's actually easy to and they do this actually. They trace, because they have to trace if you're a voter in other states as well, for example.
Yeah, probably, but I'm just saying ostensibly it's pretty easy to register and yeah.
Well, you could register to vote. The problem is that if there's no, you're gonna, your photo, especially right now, the photo ID is linked to what is called the real ID. And I mean, we could get more into it, but the point is that they've really kind of tightened the screws on the IDs, so you can't really like board flights.
I was gonna let you go back to your practice, and then we got back in the weeds. I'm just loving this conversation, is all.
No, yeah, we got back into this, but interestingly, the conversation is a good conversation to have, because then it leads you to kind of think about things, and I'm thinking about things, and the real issue is that, okay, someone has they've already registered to vote, so I'm assuming they're already going to vote. The question is it going to be the same person that registered to vote? And to have some ID in hand saying, look, I'm really that person, it's better than having no. I mean, like right now, if someone asks me for my ID, they are thrown out as poll watchers. You should never. They're claiming, so the supervisors in New York anyway were saying that you're not allowed to even ask for ID, to even if people were not clear about the spelling of their name or whatever. I mean, it's just an interesting thing. I'm not sure exactly why you're not allowed to have an ID at the polls. They're not even allowed to ask for it. And the question is, I would say 99% of people have some form of ID, and the people who don't, we can't prove that they are who they are. So why let the people vote that we don't even know who they are?
Well, they may not have IDs on them. Why should you have to? Just like you shouldn't have to prove a vaccine card to get on a flight. Do you have to show your passport to vote? Like, what if I leave my passport at home? Do you turn me away from the polls?
Well, the point is not about the passport. It's about ID, or even some sort of identification. I mean, people, like when you go to, everyone has some form ID, meaning like they have a bill, they have something. I mean, if you're basically homeless, you're not registered to vote anyway. So that's really the problem. The problem is that I feel like there's a lot of kind of duplicity in what people are saying. In one aspect, like, to register, just to get on the ballot box, just to get on the registration, you need to prove who you are, because like you said, only citizens are allowed to vote. So we do need some sort of verification that, like, you are who you say you are eligible to vote.
There's a system in place. I mean, you were just saying.
But that's my point. But my point is that when someone comes to the ballot box and they don't come in with an ID, that it's a problem, I feel, or some sort of identifying anything. I just claim to be, David Smith.
And you think it's enough of a problem to influence the outcome of an election with a votership of 360 million people in the country, or whatever, 390, however many million people live in the U.S.?
But, the interesting thing is that, like you said, like what we didn't say, but was the thing about this country is that we have kind of state-run voting. And when you have state-run voting, basically the entire electoral pie goes by the state.
Mm-hmm.
So certain states are decided by 20,000 votes. And when there's 20,000 votes in place that could decide the results of an election, that's where there's a problem.
Well, I mean, the whole electoral college system's fucked, but that's my opinion.
But the electoral college system actually helps the somewhat of the fraud out, because, like you said, if there's going to be a popular vote mandate, it's a lot harder to kind of screw up 360 million votes. On the other hand, the electoral college system has some positive benefits, because if you're looking at like states like California, they would probably, and New York, two states would ultimately decide the entire election. So none of the other states would matter. Like no one would actually even campaign there. And that's really where the other problem is that, that's really just going to be, we'll become more of a coastal elite government. I mean, there wouldn't be any other people that were consulted. And that's really, like you said, like you were saying, like this country's so massive, the interior of the country would simply not get as much representation in that system.
I think the executive shouldn't have that much power. I think the head of the legislative should hold executive power, just like in Canada, basically. And I think, yes, every one person should get a one vote for the executive. And then in Congress, then it would have, like, the Senate serves the function of representation in terms of like where you are. A small state gets as many representatives as a big state. That function of needing balance, I think, comes from the Senate. That would be my ideal.
No, I mean, you're probably right. And that's why, again, I do point to the system that they have in England where, it's basically
the executive in England is a figurehead who holds no real power,
which could easily be replaced by the executive is prime minister, which is voted on by
they're the functional executive, but on paper, the executive's the king or queen.
Right. Well, of course. And the executive there is a hard executive, meaning, they get the power to decide if they're willing to accept the prime minister, which is a lot of power. That's ultimately the biggest power. It's
not wielded anymore, but it's on paper. That's, yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's not wielded anymore. We could debate that. I mean,
well, I know in Canada, like the prime minister chooses the governor general, who's basically the executive. So the governor general is appointed on the advice of the prime minister. So technically they're above the prime minister, but the prime minister can fire them. There are some ceremonial figure. In England, it's a little different because the crown is physically there. They don't have like a governor general.
Exactly. Well, that's the interesting thing. The interesting thing that I find in just overall is that I actually like the English system a lot because of that. Because I feel like at least the king and queen, theoretically, I mean, the theory behind it is that the king and queen have a lot of power, a lot of property in England, and they actually care about England, for example.
I mean, if I were to vote in the U.S., it would be for the Democrats reluctantly. I don't think they're a good party for a lot of the same reasons you don't. But in Canada, I call myself a Republican because I'm actually for Canada becoming a republic. Like, as much as I think the Queen was fun and I liked her as a cult of a personality, I am not for Canada being a monarchy, like, at all. Like, I think it's the stupidest. It should be a republic.
I totally agree. I mean, I really don't understand why Canada is still a Canadian is English territory.
No, it's an independent country.
Well, they say that, except who's on there, on the coinage,
Well, yeah, but British Parliament yields no power over Canada at all.
No, I understand that. I just don't know. I mean, again, there's a lot of political power behind the scenes that me and you probably don't know about.
I agree with that. I got to end it there. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, same. I mean, I don't know how we got into this conversation with Canada, but that's another thing. But I do like talking about it just because I think it opens up people's kind of viewpoints in mind, and everyone could decide what they want based on knowledge. But I feel like without the knowledge, you can't really decide well.
I completely agree, David. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today.
All right. Thank you for having me on, and I look forward to kind of speaking to you further.
Dr. David Shusterman is a urologist based out of New York.